Welcome to Haunted Voice Channel. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now, let's get started. I've been a park ranger in the remote stretches of Black Creek National Forest for over 5 years. The land is vast and empty, aside from a few trails and campsites. No one ventures too deep into the woods, though. The locals have stories, folktales really, about things that live out there. They call them whisperers or skinwalkers, but I always dismissed it as superstition. That is, until last week. It started like any other shift. I was scheduled for a 5-day patrol in the deepest part of the forest, far from the well-marked trails. My only company was a radio with patchy reception and a small cabin that served as my base of operations. The isolation never bothered me. In fact, I preferred it. No screaming kids or careless hikers, just the quiet whisper of the trees. On the second night, the radio crackled, pulling me out of a restless sleep. Static filled the airwaves, interspersed with faint, garbled words. I sat up, fumbling to adjust the signal, but all I got was the same jumbled noise. I switched it off, figuring it was just interference, and went back to sleep. The following morning, I found something unsettling. A set of footprints circled the cabin, too large to be human, but far too narrow to belong to a bear or a wolf. They led off into the forest, vanishing into the underbrush. I should have reported it, but curiosity got the better of me. I decided to follow them. The tracks led deeper into the forest than I'd ever been before. The air grew heavy the further I went, the trees standing unnaturally still. No birds, no wind, just silence. I kept moving, telling myself it was probably an animal I didn't recognize. That was until I saw the first one. It looked like a deer at first, standing perfectly still among the trees. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. Its eyes, they were too large, too human, and its legs, bent backward at odd angles, trembled as if they were struggling to hold the weight of its own body. It stared at me, unblinking. I stepped back, my pulse pounding in my ears. Without warning, it let out a scream, a shrill, unnatural sound that echoed through the forest. I turned and ran. Back at the cabin, I locked the door and tried to shake off the encounter. My radio was still dead, and I wasn't about to head out again to check the antenna. As night fell, the sound started. First, it was a rustling outside the window, like someone or something was brushing up against the walls. Then came the whispers. They started softly, barely audible, but grew louder as the night wore on. I pressed my ear to the wall, straining to make out the words. It wasn't English. It wasn't even a language I recognized, just guttural, rasping sounds that sent a shiver down my spine. I checked the windows but saw nothing outside. Just the oppressive darkness, deeper than any night I'd ever known. Sleep was impossible. I sat by the door, gripping my flashlight and the rifle we were issued for emergencies, waiting for the whispers to stop. They never did. By dawn, the forest was silent again. I ventured outside, exhausted, but determined to figure out what was happening. That's when I saw the totems, roughly a dozen of them, twisted from branches and bones, arranged in a circle around the cabin. They hadn't been there when I went to bed. My stomach dropped. Someone had been out here. Someone, or something, had been watching me. I packed up my things. I didn't care if my patrol was cut short. I needed to get back to the main station and report this. As I headed back, I noticed the trees seemed closer together, their branches weaving into one another like skeletal fingers. The path I'd taken into the woods seemed to shift beneath my feet, leading me in directions I didn't remember. And then, I saw it again. The deer thing, or whatever it was, stood ahead of me on the trail. Only this time, it wasn't alone. There were more of them, twisted figures, some looking like animals, others like people, but all wrong. Their limbs moved in unnatural jerks, their heads twitching too fast, their mouths opening wide as if to speak, but producing only static, like a broken radio. I raised the rifle, my hands shaking. One of the figures took a step forward, and I froze. It wasn't an animal at all. It was a man. His park ranger uniform was torn. His face stretched into an expression of horror. I recognized him. It was Jacob, another ranger who had gone missing 2 months ago. They said he probably got lost or fell off a cliff. But now I wasn't so sure. And he opened his mouth, and this time I could hear the whispering, clear as day. "Leave." I turned and ran, not stopping until I reached the edge of the forest. By the time I made it back to the station, my legs were trembling, my mind spinning. I tried to explain to my supervisor, but all I got in return were skeptical looks and suggestions that I take a few days off. That night, as I lay in my own bed, I heard it again, the whispers, coming from the tree line just outside my window. I haven't gone back to Black Creek since, but every night the voices grow louder, and this morning I found footprints, large, narrow footprints, circling my house. I think they followed me. Or worse, I never left. I've always loved camping. There's something about leaving the noise and chaos of the city behind and stepping into the calm embrace of nature that feels like therapy. So when I heard about the vast, untouched woods of Black Hollow, I knew I had to go. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a solo trip, just me, my tent, and the endless sky. But now, as I sit here in the dark, listening to the silence that presses against my skin, I realize just how wrong I was. This place isn't calm. It's something else entirely. The kind of stillness that feels watched. I first noticed the silence when I arrived. Normally, there's a chorus of birds or the rustling of small animals in the brush, but Black Hollow was different. It was as if the forest held its breath, waiting for something. My footsteps seemed to echo louder than they should, even on the soft moss and damp leaves. I tried to shake off the feeling, chalking it up to my city-dulled senses being overly sensitive. I found a decent spot by the river, where the water was clear and cold, its trickle the only sound that broke the silence. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and tried to settle in. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the trees cast long, skeletal shadows that stretched and twisted like fingers reaching for me. I laughed at myself, brushed off the strange thoughts, and forced myself to relax. But then I saw him. It was just a flicker at first, out of the corner of my eye. A tall figure, standing at the edge of the trees. He wore a park ranger's uniform, though it looked old, as if it had been forgotten in the forest for decades. His face was shadowed, the brim of his hat hiding his eyes. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. He just watched. I called out to him, waving, hoping he'd reassure me with some friendly banter, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, his body rigid, a statue in the twilight. I blinked, and in that split second, he was gone. I couldn't help but shiver. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination, and I settled back down by the fire, trying to shake the unease. But the forest felt different now. The silence was no longer calming. It was suffocating. Night settled in, heavy and oppressive, wrapping around me like a dark shroud. I lay in my tent, staring up at the thin fabric, trying to drown out the nagging fear gnawing at my stomach. I could swear I heard faint footsteps circling my camp, but when I unzipped the tent and peered out, there was nothing. Just the stillness, the oppressive quiet that had become my unwelcome companion. I barely slept. When dawn finally broke, I felt an inexplicable urgency to pack up and leave. I'd had enough of this place. As I loaded up my backpack, I caught sight of something on the ground near my fire pit, a single enormous paw print as big as my hand. I squatted down examining it, my heart pounding. It wasn't any animal I recognized. Not a bear, not a wolf. The shape was all wrong, with toes elongated like a human hand. I decided to hike out of the forest, but as I moved, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of movement behind the trees, something that seemed to dart away just as I turned my head. And then, just as quickly, I'd see that same strange ranger figure standing there, always at the periphery of my vision, never moving, always watching. I quickened my pace, practically running now, branches clawing at my arms and face. My heart was racing, fear tightening in my chest. I knew I was close to the trailhead, to safety, when I stumbled across a small cabin I hadn't noticed on my way in. The windows were shattered and the door hung ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. Inside, the cabin was dark and smelled of mold, but what caught my eye was a wall covered in photographs, all taken in this very forest. Some were old and faded, showing people in outdated clothing, but others looked recent, capturing scenes from within Black Hollow, and there among them was a picture of me, setting up my tent by the river. I backed away, heart hammering, when I noticed the next picture. A close-up of me sleeping, taken just last night. I bolted out of the cabin, sprinting through the woods. I could feel something behind me, hear its footsteps pounding the earth, closing in. I didn't dare look back. I burst out of the trees, stumbling into the parking lot where my car was waiting. I threw myself inside, locked the doors, and didn't stop driving until I was miles away from that cursed place. It wasn't until later that I noticed something odd. I'd kept my phone in my pocket the entire time, but when I pulled it out, there was a new photo on it. It was me, standing at the edge of the forest, staring back at my own retreating figure. I was smiling, but my eyes were empty, cold, and dead. The ranger. I never found out who or what he was. And the thing in the woods? I don't know if it was real, or if Black Hollow just plays tricks on your mind, twisting your own fear into something monstrous. But as I look at that photo, I can't help but wonder, was that really me who made it out of the forest? Or did something else take my place? I've been a park ranger at Blackwood Forest for the better part of a decade, and I've seen my share of strange things out here, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered last fall. The deeper parts of Blackwood are known to be treacherous, dense with thickets and old gnarled trees that block out the sunlight even at noon. Locals avoid it, claiming that strange things happen there after dark. I always thought it was just superstition, but now, I'm not so sure. One late October evening, I was assigned to patrol the northern quadrant of the forest, near an area that locals call the Hollow. It's a place surrounded by legends, whispered stories of creatures that wander the woods and mimic the voices of the lost. I had always dismissed these as nonsense, but something about that night felt different. The air was thick, colder than usual, and there was a strange smell hanging low in the mist, a smell like damp earth and rotting leaves. The first sign that something was wrong came as I was crossing an old wooden bridge. There was a creek below, one that never seemed to run dry, no matter the season. As I walked across, I heard something splash in the water below. I stopped, shining my flashlight down into the creek, but there was nothing there. Just the slow-moving water and the reflection of the trees. But then I heard it. A faint, mocking laughter, echoing from somewhere downstream. It was distant but unmistakable. I called out, thinking it might be some campers messing around, but the only answer I got was the soft rustling of the leaves. I shrugged it off and continued on, though a nagging feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. I walked for a while until I reached the hollow. That's when the temperature dropped sharply, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me. The forest was dead silent. Not even the wind dared to move. As I moved forward, the mist grew thicker, swirling around my legs as if trying to pull me deeper. I heard a twig snap, and my flashlight beam landed on a figure standing just off the trail. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, and wrapped in a thick coat of fur. But something was off. Its body was humanoid, but its face was elongated, like a dog or a wolf. And its eyes, they were glowing, a sickly yellow that seemed to pierce right through me. I took a step back, trying to keep my breathing steady. I'd heard stories of dogmen, creatures that supposedly roamed these woods, but I'd never believed them. Now, staring into those glowing eyes, I knew I was face to face with one. The creature didn't move, just watched me, as if waiting for me to make the first move. I felt paralyzed, unable to look away. Then, without warning, it let out a low growl and took a step forward. My instincts kicked in, and I turned, running as fast as I could back toward the trail. But the mist was disorienting, and every time I thought I was getting closer to the edge of the forest, I ended up back at that same wooden bridge. It was as if the forest itself was trying to keep me trapped, spinning me in circles. I stopped, trying to catch my breath, and that's when I heard it again. Laughter, this time much closer. I whipped around, but there was nothing there, just shadows playing tricks on my mind. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. It was another figure, smaller this time, crouched low and watching me from behind a tree. I could just make out its face, human-like but with hollow, empty eyes. It had no mouth, yet I could hear it laughing, a sound that made my skin crawl. Suddenly more figures appeared, emerging from the trees, their hollow eyes fixed on me. There were 4, maybe 5 of them, and they moved in unison like they were connected somehow. They had the bodies of humans, but there was something distinctly wrong about them, as if they were puppets being controlled by some unseen force. They started to circle around me, closing in. Desperate, I shouted, trying to scare them off, but they just kept coming, moving with a jerky, unnatural gait. My heart was racing, and I knew I had to get out of there. I broke through their circle, running blindly through the trees, ignoring the branches that tore at my face and arms. I could hear them behind me, their laughter growing fainter, but still there, echoing through the woods. Finally, I stumbled into a clearing, and to my relief, I saw the lights of the ranger station in the distance. I sprinted toward them, not daring to look back. When I burst through the door, the other rangers looked at me, wide-eyed. They could see the panic on my face, and I didn't need to explain. They knew the stories. After a few moments, one of the older rangers pulled me aside. He told me about the Watchers, spirits that protect the deeper parts of Blackwood, creatures that mimic the faces of those who have lost their way. He said the Dogman was their guardian, a creature that ensures no one ventures too far into their domain. I asked him if anyone had ever come back from the hollow after seeing the Watchers. He looked at me, his face pale, and simply shook his head. It's been a year since that night, and I've avoided the northern quadrant ever since. But sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear that laughter again, faint and mocking, calling me back into the woods. I don't know if they'll ever stop watching, but one thing is for sure, I'm never setting foot in the hollow again. And if you ever find yourself near Blackwood Forest, take my advice. Stay on the marked trails, and never ever answer when you hear your name called from the darkness. The Watchers never forget a face. I never used to believe the stories. Growing up near Lonesome Pine National Forest, you hear all sorts of strange tales. But as a park ranger, you learn to laugh them off. Tall tales, urban legends, things that go bump in the night, until you see something you can't explain. It was the middle of October during one of our first real cold snaps of the season. I'd been assigned the graveyard shift to patrol the far end of the park. That area is the least trafficked, a place where most visitors don't venture, and it has a reputation for being strange. People say that the forest feels different there, older somehow, like it's hiding something. My co-workers joked about it, but I'd been there before. It was quiet, sure, but eerie, not really. That night was different, though. The minute I stepped out of the ranger station, I felt it. A sort of tension in the air, like the forest was holding its breath. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves under my boots and the faint rustling of the wind through the branches. I kept my flashlight low, moving quietly as I made my way down the narrow, winding trail. I figured I'd just do my rounds, check for any signs of trespassers or poachers, and head back. Routine stuff. I'd been walking for about half an hour when I noticed something strange, a flickering light up ahead. I figured it was campers, maybe some kids who'd snuck in to party. I was just about to radio it in when I heard the singing. It was low and soft, carried on the wind, and it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The voice was female, and the melody was hauntingly familiar, though I couldn't place it. I stepped off the trail, moving toward the light and the voice, curious but cautious. As I got closer, the singing stopped abruptly and the light winked out. I was plunged into darkness, the only light now coming from my own flashlight. I shone it around, looking for any sign of the campers, but there was nothing. Just trees and shadows stretching endlessly in every direction. And that's when I heard the footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere behind me. I turned, shining my flashlight back the way I'd come, but there was nothing there. The footsteps stopped, and an uneasy silence settled over the woods. I took a step forward, and that's when I saw it, movement just on the edge of my flashlight beam. A figure stood there, half hidden behind a tree. It was a woman, or at least she looked like one. Her clothes were old-fashioned, a long dress that seemed to shimmer in the faint light. She had her back to me, her long tangled hair hanging down her shoulders. I called out to her, asking if she was lost, but she didn't respond. She just stood there, perfectly still. I took a step closer, and as I did, she turned to face me. Her eyes were black, completely black, with no whites at all. Her mouth opened as if she were going to scream, but no sound came out. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my hand as I tried to process what I was seeing. That's when she began to move toward me, gliding over the ground like she wasn't even touching it. I turned and ran, sprinting back toward the trail, my heart pounding in my chest. But no matter how fast I ran, I could still hear her footsteps behind me, gaining on me. I burst onto the trail, barely stopping to catch my breath before I took off again, heading back to the station. But as I rounded a bend, I saw something that stopped me cold. It was me. Standing there in the middle of the trail was someone who looked exactly like me. Same uniform, same flashlight, even the same horrified expression. I watched in disbelief as the figure raised its hand, mirroring my movements exactly. It was like looking into a mirror, only this mirror had a mind of its own. Then, without warning, the figure's face twisted into a grin, an impossibly wide smile that stretched far beyond the limits of a human face. Its skin began to ripple, almost like it was made of liquid, and before my eyes it started to change. The skin darkened, the eyes hollowed, and the features morphed into something grotesque, something inhuman. I took a step back, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. This thing, whatever it was, had taken on my appearance, but now it was showing me its true form. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot as the creature advanced. Then I heard a voice, not a whisper, not a growl, but a perfect echo of my own voice. "You don't belong here," it said in a tone that was almost mocking. "This place isn't meant for you." I broke free from my paralysis, my instincts taking over as I turned and ran back the way I'd come. I didn't stop, not even when I heard the creature laughing, its voice blending with the wind in a chilling, unnatural chorus. When I finally reached the ranger station, I slammed the door behind me, locking it tight. The next day I reported what I'd seen, but no one believed me. They chalked it up to exhaustion, a trick of the light, an overactive imagination. But I know what I saw. Since that night, I've refused to go back to that part of the forest. I've heard rumors, whispers of other rangers seeing strange things, but they're always dismissed. They don't want to believe it, don't want to face the truth that there's something out there, something that watches, something that mimics, something that doesn't want us there. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear singing outside my window, soft and familiar, like an old lullaby. And in those moments, I wonder if I ever really left the forest at all. I'll never forget the camping trip that took me deep into the wilderness of northern Michigan. I had always loved the woods, finding solace among the towering pines and the earthy scent of moss and decay. So, when I finally took some time off work, I packed up my gear and drove out to a secluded spot I'd found on a map, miles from the nearest road. I planned to stay for a few nights, just me and the forest. Little did I know, I was stepping into something I would never be able to explain or forget. The first night was peaceful. I set up my tent by a small glassy lake, its surface still as a mirror under the rising moon. The only sounds were the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a distant owl. After a simple meal, I crawled into my tent and fell asleep easily, comforted by the familiar solitude. The second night, though, was different. I was sitting by the campfire, letting the warmth soak into my bones as I watched the last light of the day fade behind the trees. The silence settled in, thicker than usual, and I felt an inexplicable heaviness in the air, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I told myself it was just my imagination, but a part of me knew better. The woods were too quiet. There were no crickets, no owls, not even the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was as if every creature had sensed something that I hadn't. Just as I was about to go into the tent, I heard a sound, a low, almost imperceptible growl that seemed to come from the shadows just beyond the firelight. I froze, straining my ears, but the sound vanished as quickly as it had come. My heart pounded in my chest, and I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a coyote or a wolf. But something about that sound was wrong. It was too deep, too guttural, and it seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath me. I turned, sweeping my flashlight through the darkness. The beam of light cut through the trees, illuminating twisted branches that looked like skeletal fingers reaching out of the shadows. But I saw nothing. Taking a deep breath, I decided to pack up and get into my tent, thinking I'd be safer there, at least until dawn. Sleep, however, was elusive. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt a presence, as if something was watching me from just outside the thin fabric of my tent. The growling came again, closer this time, accompanied by a strange shuffling sound, like something large dragging itself over the ground. My mind raced with possibilities, but none of them made sense. I knew that the wilderness could hold strange and dangerous creatures, but this was different. This felt unnatural. The noises stopped after what felt like an eternity, and I finally drifted off, only to be awoken by the faint light of dawn filtering through the trees. I hurriedly packed up my things, deciding I'd had enough of my adventure. I could feel the forest pressing in on me as if it were trying to keep me there, suffocating me with its silence. I wanted nothing more than to get back to my car and leave. As I walked, I tried to shake off the feeling, focusing instead on the familiar sounds of birds singing in the morning light. But then, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. There, right in the middle of the path, were footprints, huge, clawed, and deeply embedded in the soft earth. They were like nothing I'd ever seen before, almost canine, but too large and with too many toes. I knelt down to inspect them, trying to make sense of it, when I heard a voice behind me. "Seen them, have you?" I jumped, nearly dropping my pack, and turned to see a park ranger standing just a few feet away. I hadn't heard him approach, which seemed impossible given the dead leaves and sticks scattered all over the ground. He was tall, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat, and there was something off about him. Something I couldn't quite place. Yeah," I managed to stammer. "Do you know what made these?" He glanced at the tracks and then back at me, his eyes narrowing. "Best you forget you saw those," he said, his voice cold and flat. "And you might want to leave these woods sooner rather than later." I nodded, suddenly eager to get away from him as much as whatever creature had left those tracks. I turned and hurried down the path, glancing back only once to find him gone, as if he'd melted into the trees. When I finally reached my car, I threw my pack into the back and sped down the dirt road, not stopping until I was miles away. I couldn't shake the image of those tracks or the way the ranger had looked at me, like he knew something he wasn't telling. It wasn't until I got home and did some research that I learned about the stories of skinwalkers and dogmen, creatures that supposedly roamed these forests, stalking those who dared to intrude. The strangest part? A few days later, I went back to that spot, driven by a need to understand, to prove to myself that it had all been a figment of my imagination. But when I arrived, there was no path, no lake, nothing that looked even remotely familiar. It was as if the forest had swallowed up any trace of where I'd been, leaving only the lingering feeling that I'd ventured somewhere I was never meant to go. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear that growl, echoing through the trees just beyond my window. It started with a dare. My friends and I were sitting around a campfire, swapping ghost stories, our laughter echoing through the forest. That's when Jason brought it up, the old cabin hidden deep in the woods, rumored to be haunted. They said people who went looking for it never came back the same, or never came back at all. Of course, he dared me to find it. Said I wouldn't have the guts. So I went alone. I left my friends behind, their laughter fading as I pushed further into the forest. The trees grew denser, the underbrush thicker. Soon I was swallowed up by the woods, the sunlight fading to a dim twilight under the thick canopy above. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of wet earth and decay. I could hear the sounds of animals scurrying in the undergrowth, but something felt off. The forest felt too still, too quiet. It was as if the trees themselves were watching me, waiting for me to cross some invisible line. After what felt like hours, I found it, a small, decrepit cabin half hidden behind a thicket of brambles. The wood was gray and rotting, the windows shattered and dark. It looked as if it had been abandoned for decades, maybe longer. But there was something strange about it, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The air around the cabin was colder, almost unnaturally so, and there was an oppressive silence that seemed to hang over the place like a shroud. "Night!" I approached the door, which hung crookedly on its hinges, and pushed it open. The wood groaned, a sound that echoed through the empty cabin like a dying breath. I stepped inside, flashlight in hand, and took in my surroundings. The cabin was small, just one room with a dusty table, a broken chair, and what looked like an old rusted wood stove. But the thing that caught my eye was a strange symbol carved into the wall, a crude drawing of something that looked like a human figure, but twisted with elongated limbs and hollow eyes. The moment I saw it, I felt a chill wash over me. I'd seen drawings like this before, in books, on the internet, cryptid folklore. My pulse quickened as I remembered the stories, tales of creatures that lurked in the woods, feeding on the fear of those who dared to enter their territory. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a story, but I couldn't ignore the sense of dread that was building inside me. I turned to leave, but as I did, I heard something. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the rustling of leaves, but there were no trees inside the cabin. I swung my flashlight around, illuminating the shadows, but there was nothing, just empty air. I laughed, a nervous, shaky sound, and took a step towards the door. That's when I saw it. A figure standing just outside the cabin, watching me through the broken window. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch and bend in unnatural ways. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were deep black pits that seemed to swallow the light. It had no face, no mouth, yet I could feel its gaze, cold and piercing, like a blade slicing through me. I froze, my heart pounding as the creature tilted its head as if curious, its body moving with a fluid, unnatural grace. It raised one long, bony arm and beckoned to me, its fingers curling in a slow, deliberate motion. I felt a pull, a strange, almost magnetic force drawing me towards it, and before I knew it, I was moving, my feet carrying me to the door without my permission. I fought against it, every muscle in my body screaming to stop, but I couldn't. I was powerless, a puppet being drawn towards the thing in the woods. As I stepped out of the cabin, the creature backed away, disappearing into the shadows, and I followed, my mind numb with terror. The forest around me seemed to warp and twist as I walked, the trees bending and stretching as if alive. I could hear whispers, soft and sibilant, filling the air with words I couldn't understand. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to turn back, but my legs wouldn't obey. I was trapped, caught in the creature's web, and there was nothing I could do to escape. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the pull released me. I stumbled, gasping for breath, and looked around. The creature was gone, vanished into the night, but I could still feel its presence, lurking just beyond the edge of the darkness. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, my heart pounding as I fled the cursed cabin and the horrors it contained. When I finally made it back to the campsite, my friends were gone. The fire was cold, the logs charred and blackened, as if it had been out for hours. I called out for them, my voice echoing through the empty woods, but there was no reply. I searched for hours, calling their names, but there was nothing. Just silence, as if the forest had swallowed them whole. I don't know how long I searched, but eventually I stumbled back to my car and drove away, my mind numb with fear. I never found out what happened to my friends. They were just gone, vanished without a trace, as if they had never existed. But I know they were there. I remember their laughter, their faces, the way they dared me to find the cabin. Sometimes late at night I hear them calling my name, their voices faint and distant, like an echo from another world. And I know deep down that they're still out there, lost in the shadows of the forest, forever caught in the creature's web, waiting for the next fool who dares to enter the woods alone. The forest felt different that night. I'd been coming to these woods for years, often alone, always chasing the solitude that only the deep wilderness could provide. But this time, as I set up my camp and the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt a strange unease, a tension in the air that I couldn't shake. It started with a low hum, almost like a vibration in my bones. At first, I thought it might be the wind, but the trees were still. There wasn't a single leaf rustling, not even the usual chorus of crickets or frogs. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that silence was what I'd come for. But as the darkness closed in, I couldn't help but feel like something was watching me from the shadows, just beyond the reach of my campfire. I was snapping twigs for kindling when I saw them, two small reflective dots in the darkness. Eyes. They blinked, then disappeared, and I was left staring into the void, straining to see what creature might be lurking out there. But there was nothing. I laughed it off, figuring it was a deer or a fox, and went back to building my fire. I had just settled into my camping chair when I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the underbrush. I froze, every muscle tensing as I scanned the darkness, but all I could see was the dancing shadows cast by the fire. I called out, half expecting a fellow camper to emerge, but there was no response. Instead, the footsteps stopped, replaced by a strange shuffling sound. It was closer now, just beyond the firelight, as if something was circling my camp. I told myself it was just an animal, probably a curious bear, and picked up the heavy flashlight beside me. I clicked it on and shinned it into the trees, the beam cutting through the darkness. And that's when I saw him. A man, tall and gaunt, with pale skin and hollow cheeks. He was dressed in ragged clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in years, but what struck me most were his eyes. They were empty, like twin pits of darkness, void of any emotion. He just stood there staring at me, his lips twisted into a thin smile. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. He didn't respond. He didn't even move. He just kept staring, that eerie smile frozen on his face. And then, slowly, he raised a finger and pointed at me. I took a step back, gripping the flashlight tighter, ready to bolt. But before I could move, he melted into the darkness, as if he'd never been there at all. My heart was racing, my breath shallow, but I forced myself to stay calm. I told myself it was just some crazed wanderer, someone who'd lost his way and stumbled upon my camp. I tried to convince myself of that, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I'd seen something in those eyes, something that wasn't human. I was gathering my things, ready to leave, when I heard it. A whisper, faint but clear. "He's coming." The words drifted through the trees, barely audible but unmistakable. I whipped around, scanning the darkness, but there was no one there, just the shadows, stretching and shifting in the firelight. I felt a chill run down my spine, like icy fingers tracing my bones. I wanted to leave, but something held me there, rooted to the spot, as if the forest itself was keeping me captive. And then I saw him again, the man standing just a few feet away, close enough that I could see the lines etched into his pale skin, the sunken hollows beneath his eyes. He wasn't alone this time. Beside him stood a woman, equally gaunt and hollow-eyed, her face twisted into that same eerie smile. She reached out a hand, beckoning me, her fingers impossibly long and thin. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering as I aimed it at them, but they didn't flinch. They just stood there, watching me with those empty eyes. I turned and ran, crashing through the trees, not caring about the branches that scratched at my face or the roots that threatened to trip me. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps soft but steady, like they were in no hurry to catch me. I didn't dare look back. Somehow I found my way to the trail, my legs burning as I sprinted down the path toward my truck. The whole time, I could feel their presence, like a cold breath on the back of my neck. Their whispers drifting through the trees, too quiet to make out, but loud enough to fill me with a terror I couldn't shake. I reached the truck, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. I threw myself inside and locked the doors, breathing hard, trying to convince myself I was safe. But as I started the engine, headlights flicked on behind me, illuminating the trees. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and there they were, standing at the edge of the forest, their eyes glowing in the darkness, their smiles wide and unnatural. I didn't wait. I floored it, speeding down the dirt road, my heart pounding as the shadows twisted and warped around me. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main road, the forest far behind me. But even now I can still feel their eyes on me, still hear those whispers, faint but insistent, drifting through the darkness. And every now and then when I'm alone at night, I catch a glimpse of them in the shadows, just waiting, their hollow eyes watching me, their smiles stretching wider and wider, as if they know that one day I'll have to return to the woods. It started as a simple camping trip. My buddy Alex and I had been planning it for months, a weekend away from the chaos of the city, just the two of us, deep in the wilderness. I've always loved the outdoors, the peace of it, the way the world felt raw and ancient out there. This time, though, something felt wrong. I could feel it the moment we crossed into the forest, the kind of stillness that presses against your skin, suffocating. We drove deeper than we ever had before, far off the beaten path, into the heart of an old-growth forest I'd only heard rumors about. No one goes out there anymore, a guy at the local gas station told us as we loaded up on supplies. I laughed it off at the time, but he wasn't joking. I saw it in his eyes. They were empty, hollow, like something had been sucked out of him long ago. The trail we followed had been overtaken by time, roots snaking through it, branches heavy and twisted, like they were reaching for us. As we hiked, the air felt thick, almost tangible, and it was quiet. Too quiet. No birds, no insects, just our footsteps and the sound of our breathing, loud and out of place. We set up camp near a clearing as the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows that twisted into strange shapes. I felt watched, but when I looked around, nothing. Just the darkening woods, their edges blurred by the dusk. After we got the fire going, Alex started joking around, talking about how we should have brought more beer and how he was going to catch the biggest fish in the creek nearby. I smiled, but my heart wasn't in it. That uneasy feeling had lodged itself deep in my gut, like a splinter I couldn't shake. We sat by the fire, talking and laughing, trying to ignore the creeping darkness around us. Then, from the edge of the clearing, I saw it. A figure, just standing there watching us. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but then Alex saw it too. He stopped mid-sentence, his face going pale. "Do you see that?" he whispered. I nodded, unable to speak. The figure didn't move, just stood there, a dark silhouette against the trees. We called out, but there was no response, no movement, just watching. After a few minutes, it turned and melted back into the shadows like it had never been there. Alex tried to laugh it off, but it was strained. Probably just a hiker, he said, poking at the fire. Nothing to worry about. But his hands were shaking. I could tell he didn't believe his own words. The rest of the night was a blur. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt that presence, standing just beyond the firelight, waiting, watching. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of something, scraping, like nails on metal. I sat up, my heart pounding, the hairs on my arms standing on end. The fire had died down, leaving only glowing embers. Alex was still sleeping, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That's when I heard it again, the scraping closer now, coming from the trees. Slowly, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The night was thick with fog, curling between the trees like ghostly fingers. The moon was high, casting pale light over the clearing. My breath felt loud in the silence. I walked toward the sound, every step feeling heavier than the last. My flashlight flickered, and for a second, I thought I saw something move just beyond the reach of its beam. My heart hammered in my chest, but I kept walking, drawn toward that terrible sound. Then I saw it. A figure hunched and twisted, dragging something through the dirt. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, its back to me. My flashlight flickered again, and for a split second, I saw its face. It wasn't human. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I ran back to the tent, shaking Alex awake. He groaned, annoyed, until he saw my face. I didn't have to say a word. He grabbed his flashlight and we both stood there, waiting, listening. The scraping had stopped. For a long time we didn't hear anything but our own breathing, shallow and fast. And then, the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, getting closer. We stood frozen, waiting for whatever was out there to reveal itself. But nothing came. The footsteps stopped just outside the tent, and then there was silence. After what felt like an eternity, the first rays of dawn began to pierce the fog, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift just a little. We packed up in silence, neither of us saying a word about what had happened. We just wanted to get out of there. As we hiked back, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Every now and then I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing, just the trees swaying in the wind. It wasn't until we reached the car that I noticed something. My heart skipped a beat as I saw the deep gouges on the side of the door, like something had clawed at it. My breath caught in my throat, and I looked at Alex, but he was already getting in, eager to leave. As we drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that twisted figure standing at the edge of the forest, watching us leave. But the road stayed empty. I should have felt relieved when we finally made it back to the main road, but that feeling didn't come. That night, when I finally got home, I went to take a shower, trying to wash off the grime and fear of the woods. That's when I noticed it. A small cut right across my stomach, thin like the edge of a razor. I didn't remember getting it. I ran my fingers over the wound, and as I did, I felt something small, hard, lodged just beneath the skin. With shaking hands, I pulled it out. It was a tooth, and it wasn't mine. I remember that night like it was yesterday, even though I've tried so hard to forget. I was working the graveyard shift at Red Hill National Park, stationed out in the middle of nowhere. It was just me and 100 square miles of dense, suffocating forest. I'd been a park ranger for over a decade, seen every kind of wildlife you could imagine. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered that night. It was sometime past midnight, and the sky was a dark, cloudless void. My flashlight barely pierced the darkness, and the radio crackled with static, more unsettling than usual. I was patrolling the North Trail, an area we called the Black Hollow, where trees grew close and the ground always felt damp. No one liked going there. The air was always thick, heavy, and smelled of decay, even in the height of summer. As I trudged along the trail, I noticed something odd. The forest was silent, and not just the kind of quiet that usually blankets the woods at night. This was an unnatural silence, like even the wind had held its breath. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, no distant hoot of an owl. Just nothing. That's when I saw it. A figure, standing motionless about 20 feet ahead, just barely visible between the trees. At first I thought it was a person, but as I squinted through the shadows, a chill ran down my spine. It was tall, too tall for a human. Its limbs were elongated, stretching unnaturally from its body, and it had eyes that glowed a sickly, yellowish green, almost like they were reflecting light, though I wasn't shining my flashlight at it. I swallowed hard, frozen in place. A voice in my head told me to run, but my feet were glued to the ground. I was a park ranger. I'd trained for this kind of thing, hadn't I? But the fear that gripped me wasn't rational. It was primal. Deep down, some part of me knew that I was not supposed to be here, that no one was supposed to see this thing. Then it moved. I say moved because walked doesn't begin to cover it. It seemed to glide, almost like it was floating, its limbs hanging loosely, as if they were barely attached to its body. It began to circle me, staying just beyond the reach of my flashlight, flickering in and out of the shadows like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to keep my light trained on it, but every time I blinked it seemed to vanish only to reappear somewhere else. Then from behind me I heard a whisper, so faint that I almost didn't catch it. But I knew it was real, because the words it spoke were my name. John. The voice was low, guttural, and laced with something sinister. It wasn't just speaking my name, it was tasting it, savoring it. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. The forest was empty except for that thick, oppressive darkness. And then a sudden foul stench hit me, a mix of rotting meat and sulfur. I gagged, covering my nose, and stumbled backward, desperate to get away from the smell. That's when I saw the tracks on the ground. They weren't footprints. They were more like claw marks gouged deep into the earth, leading off into the trees. Whatever it wasn't alone. The prints diverged, leading in multiple directions like a pack had passed through here, each claw digging into the dirt with terrifying force. I turned to go back the way I came, but I couldn't find the trail. I knew this forest like the back of my hand, yet the path had vanished, swallowed by the trees that now loomed over me like silent, waiting giants. Panic set in as I realized I was lost, disoriented in a place I'd walked 100 times before. Then I heard it, a low growl coming from somewhere to my left. I shone my flashlight in that direction, and there it was, a hulking shape, like some twisted cross between a man and a wolf. Its fur was matted and dark, its snout dripping with saliva, and its eyes, they were empty. Black pits, devoid of any hint of life, locked onto me with a hunger that chilled me to my core. And then it spoke, not with its mouth, but in my mind, like it was reaching into my thoughts, clawing through my memories. You're not the first. You won't be the last. I couldn't breathe. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening, but there was no logic here, no reason, just pure, unadulterated terror. I don't remember how long I stood there, paralyzed by fear. But at some point, the creatures disappeared. The darkness lifted, and the sounds of the forest returned, as if nothing had happened. I stumbled back to the ranger station, my mind reeling, trying to process what I'd seen. But when I tried to tell my supervisor, he just looked at me with a strange expression and shook his head. "I've heard that story before," he said, almost like he was talking to himself. "You're not the first ranger to come back with a tale like that. But no one ever believes it." As I sat there, the horrible truth dawned on me. I'd been marked. The creatures had let me go, but I knew they'd be back. Every night, when the forest goes quiet, I can feel them watching, waiting. And when I close my eyes, I still see those empty, hollow eyes staring back at me, pulling me back into that darkness, into the black hollow, where they wait for me to return. I'm not the first, and I know I won't be the last, but I fear that next time I might not make it out alive. We had planned this trip for months. It was supposed to be a weekend of hiking, camping, and unwinding in the middle of nowhere. Just the four of us, me, my girlfriend Claire, and our friends Nate and Sophie. We were all craving an escape from the noise of the city, so we picked a remote spot in the woods by Cold Creek. The name sounded peaceful enough, right? Just a quiet little creek tucked away in the forest. But when we told the owner of the cabin where we parked the car that we'd be camping there, his face went a bit pale. "You be careful out there," he said. "Strange things happen near that creek." I remember laughing, thinking it was just some local trying to spook tourists. We were seasoned campers after all. We'd done this 100 times before. Nate joked about bringing a silver bullet and garlic, just in case. We didn't take him seriously. None of us did. We hiked deep into the woods that first day, farther than we'd planned, but the scenery was worth it. Massive trees towered over us, their branches creating a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. We followed the creek until we found the perfect clearing to set up camp. The creek water was cold and clear, and the only sound was the gentle rush of it flowing over the rocks. By the time night fell, we were exhausted but content. We lit a fire, cooked some food, and sat around telling stories. The stars were out, brighter than we'd ever seen them, and the only thing that seemed out of place was the thick fog that rolled in just after sunset, creeping in off the creek like a living thing. It hung low, swirling through the trees, but none of us were too bothered by it. It gave the night an eerie, mysterious vibe, which Nate leaned into by telling us a story he'd heard about Cold Creek. "You know this place has a history, right?" he started, flashing a grin at me and Claire. "Back in the 1800s, they say there was a village nearby. People settled here to farm and raise their families. But one year there was a brutal winter, the kind that starves a town. Crops failed, food ran out. The story goes that they turned to, well, desperate measures." Sophie, who had been listening intently, narrowed her eyes. "Desperate measures? Like what?" Nate's grin faded. "Cannibalism." Claire groaned and tossed a marshmallow at him. "Seriously? That's the best you've got?" Nate shrugged. "I'm just saying there are legends about this place. They say you can still hear the cries of the lost villagers wandering the woods, hungry for something more." We all laughed it off, though there was a part of me that found it unsettling, especially with the fog thickening around us, creeping closer to our little circle of firelight. But eventually, we brushed it off as another spooky campfire story and turned in for the night. I woke up a few hours later. At first, I didn't know why. Everything was still, quiet, except for the soft rustling of the leaves. The fire had long since died down, and our tent was filled with the pale light of the moon filtering through the fog. I lay there listening, but something felt off. It was too quiet. No crickets, no wind, just an oppressive silence. And then I heard it, a faint splash like something or someone wading through the creek. At first I thought it was Nate or Sophie getting up to relieve themselves, but then I realized it was coming from further downstream, in the direction of the thickest part of the fog. The sound was slow, deliberate, like something was dragging itself through the water. I nudged Claire. "Do you hear that?" She groaned softly and sat up, listening. Her eyes widened as the splashing grew louder, now accompanied by a low, wet, gurgling sound, like someone trying to speak through water. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know." I reached for my flashlight, heart pounding in my chest, and unzipped the tent. Cold air rushed in, making me shiver, though it wasn't from the temperature. I shone the beam of light toward the creek, but the fog was so thick it swallowed the light almost immediately. The splashing stopped. For a few seconds, everything was still again. Claire and I exchanged a nervous glance, her hand gripping my arm. Then, out of nowhere, a loud crack echoed through the woods like a branch snapping under the weight of something heavy. We both jumped, and in the tent next to ours I heard Nate curse under his breath. "What the hell was that?" he called out, his voice muffled by the fabric of his tent. "I don't know," I answered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Stay inside for now." Then we heard something else, a soft rhythmic sound almost like crying. It was faint, barely audible but unmistakable. It came from the direction of the creek, floating toward us on the fog. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Claire whispered, That's a child." I shook my head, trying to make sense of it. There's no way. There's no one out here. But the sound persisted, growing louder, closer, as if the child was moving toward us. It was a soft, pitiful wail, and underneath it was something else. A strange, distorted whispering, like multiple voices speaking in unison. It felt wrong, like the air was being sucked out of the forest. I grabbed a rock from the fire pit and hurled it in the direction of the creek. "Who's out there?" I shouted, my voice shaky. "Show yourself." Nothing but silence. The crying had stopped, and now there was only the fog swirling unnaturally thick around us. Suddenly Sophie screamed. I whipped around to see her stumbling out of the tent, her face pale as death. "Nate's gone," she yelled. "He's gone." Claire and I rushed over. Sophie was shaking, pointing at the empty space where Nate had been sleeping. His sleeping bag was still zipped up, but he was gone, like he'd just disappeared without a trace. "There's no way he just left," Claire said, her voice trembling.